back to, on page 155. So we are into agency. Just having our overview as we're remembering. And a couple of hours ago, we started talking about this chart, right? A couple of hours ago, talking about this chart, where we said that who is the client hiring? They're hiring the firm, and the client is the principal, and the firm is the agent. And when you have a client relationship with somebody, you owe them those fiduciary duties. We're good on what obedience is. We're good on loyalty, disclosure, confidentiality, accountability, reasonable skill, and care. So we spent the first hour, hour and a half going over our fiduciary duties, our old car, obedience, loyalty, disclosure, confidentiality, accountability, reasonable skill, and care, that if you have a client relationship with a buyer or seller, your firm does, then you owe them those duties. And if we violate any of those duties, we're violating the law. And many people said, well, can they take us to court and sue us for that, breaking those fiduciary duties? They can, because we do have liability. We do have liability. We said we were working for clients. We were working with customers. And remember, customers are people we do not owe those fiduciary duties to, but we do owe them something, right? We owe them everybody honesty. We owe everybody fairness. And we owe everybody material fact. So when our firm is representing the seller and another firm is representing the buyer, that buyer is our customer and the seller is our firm's client. Our firm's client. So we have said that they are not hiring us, the licensee, they're hiring the firm. But we still owe the client or the principal fiduciary duties as the licensee through that whole idea of sub-agency. We're an agent of the firm, a licensee, and the firm is the one that owes the fiduciary duties to the principal. They didn't hire us to hire the firm, but we still owe our fiduciary duties as a licensee to the principal through that whole idea of sub-agency. Jeremy.
Let's say like a client just wants to buy a house, but they don't know anybody in the actual firm. How does the firm choose who to give that person to?
Good question, Jeremy. Make sure I have your question right. Jeremy says, hey, great, I got it, that they're hiring the firm and not me, the licensee. If somebody, a buyer or seller, comes to the firm, we're going to talk to a person, right? So pretend that they talk to the broker in charge. The person, the broker in charge, the BIC that's in charge of the supervision of all the licensees at one office location. Then if that buyer and seller comes into the firm, then how does the firm decide what licensee will work with that particular buyer or seller? Is that the question, Jeremy? Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you for your question. And it will depend on what the firm's policy is. And so that's a great question, right? Because we know that firms can have policies. We know that we don't even know all of the options available to a consumer here in the state of North Carolina with regards to representation. We don't even know that yet, right? But what we do know is that firms can have policies.
Is that something just to ask them when you interview?
Good point, Jeremy, right? Is that another good question to put on our list of questions to ask a firm when we interview firms? Is that another good question? Jeremy, thank you for that. Another good question. If people come into the firm, the office location, and they don't know anybody at that office location, a licensee, but they do want to work with that firm, how does that firm determine which agent within the firm or licensee within the firm will be helping that particular person that walked in off the street? It's a very good question. Good to add to your list, right? Wonderful. Thank you, Jeremy. So, we owe, as licensees, owe our fiduciary duties to the principal through that whole idea of sub-agency. We had our Working with Real Estate Agents brochure that we use here in North Carolina by North Carolina Real Estate Commission rule, and that brochure, in that brochure has the list of all of the options available to the consumer. We said that there was a receipt in the form of a flap that we're going to ask the consumer to sign. Can we force them to sign it? No. When we go through our brochure, it is our guide to make sure the consumer knows all of the agency options available to them in the state of North Carolina. We're disclosing all of the options available. We're discussing each one of them at length. And then we're having them decide what kind of agency sounds good to them. At that point, we tell them whether our firm offers that option or not, right? Sure. We determine at that point if our firm offers that option or not. Because as a firm, we don't have to offer all of the choices, because it's firm policy. Then if they choose an option that our firm doesn't offer, we just what? Refer them to a firm who does offer that. So we know we use our agency, working with real estate agents brochure, as a guide to help us disclose all the options available to the consumer, discuss them with them at length, have them decide what kind of agency representation they want. And we like to remember that, redeem them, right? Redeem them. We said the flap itself, we do not have to get signed, right? We don't have to get it signed. We're going to ask them to sign it, and if they refuse to sign it, we just do what?
File it for 3 years.
Right, Jeremy says we're going to put their name on it. Thank you, Jeremy. Our information, then we're going to put in our file, let's keep it in our file for 3 years. North Carolina Real Estate Commission rule. We keep all of our files for 3 years. Just not.
I have a question. So, if they fill this out, is this information kept private, or is this information like sold to the firm or anything like that, or they won't get any mail if they fill this out?
Tristana, thank you for the question. Make sure I have it correct, right? With regards to this flap, when we say that we're keeping it in our file, Tristana asked what are we doing with their contact information that they put on here? Are we going to sell it to anybody? Are we selling it to the firm? What is actually are we going to do with this information? Good question, Tristana, and thank you for that question. We're going to, all it's asking on the flap is their name, their full name, that's it, and their signature, and the date. So that's the only information that we have is their name itself. And we don't sell that to anybody, and that's a great question. We don't sell that to anybody, we don't use that in any way other than to indicate as a receipt that they have received the Working with Real Estate Agents brochure. Does that answer your question? Wonderful. Thank you for the question. About this, we said earlier, before lunch, that we're presenting this Working with Real Estate Agents brochure at first substantial contact, right? And we've described and defined what first substantial contact is. When a consumer starts telling us, or we start asking as the licensee, any personal, confidential, motivations, needs, wants, and desires types of questions, or giving us any kind of information that can affect their what? Their negotiating position, right? We want to make sure they keep that information personal and confidential until they hire a firm to represent them. Because what we're getting ready to learn, if they share that information with us, or we ask that information, and we don't have a agency relationship with them, owing them those fiduciary duties, we're going to be required by law to disclose the information to our client. Right? So if our firm's representing the seller, and a prospective buyer comes and drops by the office and talks to us about a home that our firm has for sale and discloses personal and confidential information, who do we owe fiduciary duties to? The seller. And remember, if we don't tell the seller the information that the buyer just shared with us, who represents them? Not us, not our firm. We have to make sure we share that information with the seller. And if we don't, we're violating what?
The law.
Jeremy says the law. Thank you, Jeremy, and that is right. We're violating agency law. We just violated our fiduciary duties. So we're required by law. So we need to make sure that the consumer understands they need to keep the personal confidential information personal and confidential until they hire a firm. And we put on our consumer hat, buyers and sellers. Is that something we would want to know? Right. So when you're out there in real life, you have the feeling of how important it is to let them know about representation. So we're at first substantial contact, we're presenting this. What is the definition of first substantial contact? When people are providing the personal, confidential motivation, needs, wants, and desires. And when does it happen? We said we're going to provide this before we discuss any of that information, but we're not discussing this information necessarily when somebody calls us on the phone and asks us about a price of a home, right? All we provided was information about the house. Could they go, thank you, and hang up? Sure. Have we created first substantial contact? No. Somebody walks through an open house. Hello, how are you?
Great.
Welcome. Melea Lemon, representing the seller from Lemon Realty. Enjoy the home and all the lemon-related refreshments. Lemonade, lemon squares, lemon drops. And they can come in and come out, and have we created that first substantial contact?
Nope.
Nope. And then if we're standing in Starbucks line, could they say, oh my goodness, I see your tag, you're a realtor. Yes, and let me tell you some information generally about the area. Have we created that first substantial contact? No. No. But if we do, we need this, right? Disclose all of their options. We said that we went through several scenarios of meeting sellers. We said that we could have a 3-day conversation, 3-year-long conversation with the seller and never have crossed the line into first substantial contact, right? But when is the last time we can present this working with real estate agents brochure to the seller?
For opening the door.
Heather says at the listing presentation. And then we described what happened in the listing presentation. Hey, and we used John earlier. He gave me permission to volunteer to be the seller for earlier. So John says, hi, please come to talk to me about listing my home for sale. I want to meet the house, right? Then I said, hey, are you okay, John, if we sit down and talk about your real estate needs? Yes. Now what I was getting ready to do was present all the information about me and my firm, and probably at the same time he was going to get ready to tell me some personal, confidential motivations, needs, wants, and desires. So I've got to do what? Tell him his options available to him for representation here in the state of North Carolina when you're selling your house. So the last time we can present working with real estate agents brochure North Carolina to a seller is the listing presentation. And then we said there was a last time for the buyer, right? We know buyer could call us on the phone. We're going to adhere to whatever our personal business policy is with regards to realtor safety. We're going to adhere to our firm's policy with regards to realtor safety. And if we desire to meet a prospective buyer at a home and that we do not know that prospective buyer, we're going to at minimum buddy up with somebody else and never meet anybody alone at a house of somebody that you don't already know.
Is that just like a guideline or like a rule?
Oh, Michael says, can we please clarify if that is a North Carolina Real Estate Commission rule or a personal business practice? Thank you, Michael. Thank you. It is a personal business practice. Does that answer your question, Michael? And yes, thank you for bringing that up. Clarifying the difference between commission rules, statutes, firm policies, personal business policies, right? So your personal business policy could be, right? I do not meet people at homes alone where I do not already have a business relationship created with them, right? You could have a firm policy, and another question to put on your list of questions for interviewing firms. Do you have a safety policy that the firm, everybody in the firm must adhere to? Because many times there is a firm policy regarding safety, that you do not get in the car with anybody or meet anybody where you haven't brought them into the office, for example, or gotten a copy of their driver's license, for example. Rachel, is that what you're going to say?
Yeah, my dad, worked for my dad. He won't even let me leave the office if you don't have a copy of their driver's license.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rachel. What Rachel was sharing with us is that their firm policy is you do not leave the office with anybody without having a copy of their driver's license left at the office on file. Thank you, Rachel, for sharing that. So another good question for your firms, what is your safety policy? So for some reason, you are meeting said buyer at a house, and you have your partner, and it's pouring down rain, and you have not had first substantial contact. We know if we don't have first substantial contact yet, we don't have to present this. But when is the last time for a buyer?
We open the door.
Prior to opening the door. Because what John was sharing with us earlier today, because could they give up their negotiating position as soon as you physically open the door,
Yes.
right? Because they could go, oh my gosh, I love this house. And have they just ruined it for themselves? Sure. Or, oh, this is dumb. If we could get this for a really low price, right? Whichever way, they could be giving up some of their negotiating position. So we want it literally before they open the door. Last time the real estate commission says that we can present this to a buyer is before you open the door. Does everybody feel good and everybody feel comfortable on that so far? John?
If you do not get the signature,
Yes.
what are the consequences?
Good. John, thank you for the question. What I heard John say is if you do not get signatures on our receipt or the flat, what was the second part of that?
And what are the consequences?
What are the consequences to us as a licensee if we do not get their signatures? And John, thank you for that question and good follow-up. Can we force anybody to sign this? No. And will we get in trouble are we violating the real estate commission rules by not forcing the client or the consumer to sign this? No. We're not violating any North Carolina Real Estate Commission rules or statutes by not forcing the consumer to sign. Because we know we can't force them to sign, but we are going to indicate that we spoke to John Smith and Jane Doe. On here, we're going to fill out our information and we're going to tear this off. I don't want to tear off this flat, but this part tears off and we give the brochure itself to the consumer. John, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you for your question. Tatum?
Just for example, like opening the door, pouring down rain, could you verbally go over the things on the pamphlet, or do you have to physically show them and give it to them before you open the door?
Good question, Tatum. Thank you for your question. Tatum said, you keep saying you'd be literally before you open the door. Literally. Could you go over this verbally and then walk inside and fill out the paper? Could you? Could you? As long as you went over everything, right? As long as you went over everything. Could you? And then you could walk in and say, and let them verify that everything is as you said, and then indicate that you. Tatum, does that answer your question? Wonderful. Thank you for your question. Everybody good so far? Working with real estate agents brochure. Are there times when you are not face-to-face having that agency conversation? Sure. Sometimes you're over the phone and somebody, that seller we were talking about on that first day, right? In California, that buyer that we were talking about on the first day in Illinois, or no, it was New York City. New York City. Remember our scenarios that first day? If we were talking to that seller in California who had property to sell here in North Carolina, could we start a conversation and then start telling this personal confidential information? Are we ever going to see them in person? I don't know, right? Do we still need to disclose all the information available in our agency brochure here in North Carolina? We do. So we're going to talk about what we're referencing with Tatum, talk about everything that's on the brochure, and make sure we go over everything. Can we discuss, disclose, and then decide? Yes. Over the phone, absolutely, over the phone. And then, but within 3 days, we need to get them what we call a hard copy, right? We need to get them a hard copy. And make sure they have a hard copy. And we have how many days to do that? 3. We've had a conversation with them, we've gone over everything verbally, we follow up with a hard copy within 3 days, and then we still go through it with them while it's sitting in front of them, right? The words are sitting in front of them, and then go, do you understand? Yes, so you still need to go through the brochure once I actually receive it again. Once they receive it again. Are y'all ready to talk about the choices available? Yes, tell us. You've been leading us along all morning. Tell us the choices. Here are the choices available to consumers with regards to representation here in the state of North Carolina. Single agency, dual agency, designated agency, or guess what? No agency at all. No agency at all. We have 4 things up on the board. Are we getting ready to list some stuff? Could you do one of those foldies or foldables that we talked about? Take an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, folding it in half, and then folding it in half and again, and you unfold it, and we have 4 columns now? Could you do that here? Sure you could do that. So let's talk about each one of these individual. Single agency. Single agency. In all the scenarios, we've got 2 players, or 2 possibilities of people to represent. Buyers and sellers for our examples, okay? Buyers and sellers. So when we have single agency, that means that we have, with the buyer and the seller in the same transaction, there is one firm representing the seller and a completely different firm representing the buyer. So if we had blue firm representing the seller and orange firm representing the buyer, does each person, the buyer and the seller, have a separate firm representing them and their interest?
Yes.
Sure, so they've each being represented by a single agency. Buyer by a single agency and the seller by a completely other agency. Blue agency. Good. So when we have single agency and there's a buyer and seller in a transaction together, how many firms are there? 2. 2. So that's one option available to a consumer, single agency. Do you want to hear how we explain that out in the real world?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Who would like to be my consumer? Volunteer for consumer. Heather says she will volunteer for consumer. Heather, thank you for coming into the office and talking to me about what? Talking to me, my firm, about options available to you for representation here in purchasing property in North Carolina. One of the options available to you is the idea about single agency. That means that if we have a seller and a buyer in the same transaction, that you will hire a separate firm that represents your interest only, and the seller will have a separate firm that represents their interest only. So this is what it will look like when we get in the car and go look at our homes for sale. The first house we're going to see is Blue Realty's home over here. They're representing the seller. Blue Realty is representing the seller over there. You've hired us, Orange Realty. So when we go see the first home, it's listed by a completely different firm. So when we go in there, our firm, Orange Realty, is fully representing you to get the what? Best price and terms for you. And the seller has a separate firm that's going to represent them. So the first house is what? 2 separate firms, one representing the interest of the buyer and a completely different firm representing the interest of the seller. Then, Heather, there's another option available to you as far as representation goes. It's called dual agency. It's called dual agency, where we still have the same buyer and the same seller. One firm is representing the interest of both in the same transaction. Dual agency, because we can have one firm, or we have one firm representing both the buyer and the seller. So we are in agreement that the client is hiring the firm, not us, the licensee. Wonderful. Because sometimes you see a person's name on the name rider out front of the house where the real estate sign is. Is that the licensee in the firm that is representing the firm when they're talking to the seller? So when we have dual agency, it can either be one licensee that has their name on that sign out in front of the home listed for sale by their firm, and have the buyer in their car driving them that buyer around on behalf of the firm. They drive up to that house, and whose name is on the name rider on the sign? The person that brought the buyer in, right? So that's one agent, or one licensee, and one firm. That's dual agency, right? We all agreed that they hired the firm. Could I be the buyer, being the licensee within the firm that's driving Heather around in the car to show her homes? And then we drive up to a house, and out front is a sign, my firm sign, but another name listed under there, right? That can be dual agency as well.
Because it's still under
weird.
the same firm.
Jeremy?
Because it's still under the same firm.
Thank you, Jeremy. Jeremy says because it's still under the same firm. Thank you, Jeremy, for that comment.
Would,
Right.
would dual agency be one of the most common if you're working with only sellers? Because you want to bring in potential buyers as well.
Good, and good question, Jeremy. Thank you for the question. What I'm hearing Jeremy say is it common practice for firms to practice dual agency? Because can you find a firm in our market that will only represent buyers? Could they?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, they could.
And that would be what kind of agency? Single or dual? Single. Could we have a firm that represents only sellers? We could. And that would be single agency as well. But is it common in our market to see that? No. No. So good question, Jeremy, and thank you for that. Remember when we were talking about the history of agency and how our industry came into being, and how we got here today, and how I said early on that all brokers representing the seller's interest only, even if you had the buyer in the car and you never met the seller? And then here we got buyer agency in the 1990s. And how weird it was. It was just weird that now we represented the buyer. And where was I going with that? I was like, I have no idea. Okay, that's what
Now you're
it's like,
in the-
I don't know, because you're telling
Now
the
you're in
story.
Okay.
So, thank you.
Dual agency?
Dual agency. So, back to Jeremy's question. Back to Jeremy's question. I was so involved in my story. Back to Jeremy's question, though, because that's where I'm leading. Back in the 90s, when buyers had the opportunity for representation, here's what happened. There was a market for firms representing the buyer only. So we did have firms at that time that represented only buyers. And they were single agency firms. They represented buyers only and never represented sellers. And then those were popular for a period of time and were common in the market. And then now we've moved away from that, and we have many firms that offer and practice dual agency. So thank you for that question. That answer and expand once I got back on track with the story. Okay, good. Wonderful. So dual agency, we know that they're hiring the firm, and y'all seem very comfortable with that. They're not hiring us the licensee. So it could be one licensee that has their name rider there at the bottom of the sign, and that same licensee drive up with the buyer in the driveway. Or it can be a different person's name on the name rider and different agent driving up and bringing that buyer to that property. Both have hired the firm, not us, the licensee. So that's dual agency. Dual agency. Either one of those scenarios, it is the firm that is being hired by the buyer and the seller. Does it make sense? Does anybody have any questions about that so far? Straight question. Let's think about questions that could come up. If we had a buyer and a seller and they both hired the same firm to represent their interest, we know that the buyer has hired the firm to get what? The best price and terms for the buyer. And that same firm has been hired by the seller to get the best price and terms for the seller.
Different licensees?
John says different licensees.
Could be the
Were they
same.
different, or in your example? Or
Either one.
Okay.
Right, because either one, right? Either one. So thank you, John, for that clarifying statement, right? It could be either one. One licensee or two. They didn't hire the licensee, they hired the firm. So either one or two agents, either way. So if you are a buyer in that situation, Heather is our buyer, and let's all put our buyer hats on. If she just said, please hire my firm, so that you can have representation, and that firm will get you the best price and terms. But the firm's representing both the buyer and the seller. And you've just told the seller, in the same transaction, you're there to get their best price and terms. Are those two competing? Those are two competing. How are we gonna do that? If those are our fiduciary duties, get best price and terms for both the buyer and the seller in the same transaction, how will we accomplish that? Working with real estate agents for sure. Dahlia says, would we meet with each one separately and make sure we presented working with real estate agents for sure?
Right, so you're meeting them separately, so you're not, you're not disclosing any personal information between the two guys. Or would you?
Did everybody hear what Dahlia said? Let's work with that. Can we work with that? Dahlia says, what makes sense to me so far with the, 2 hours that we've talked about agency so far, just with the little bit of information we have, Dahlia says, hey, we all agree that doesn't sound right, right? How can one firm have fiduciary duties, clients, both buyer and seller in the same transaction? They have opposing goals. Low price for the buyer, high price for the seller. They're opposing goals. What Dahlia said is, and thank you, Dahlia, for the comment. What Dahlia says is, first, it makes sense to have them separate and make sure we presented our working with real estate agents brochure to the buyer. And if we got any personal and confidential information, let's not share it with who? The seller. And in a different room, we'll go to the seller and we'll present working with real estate agents brochure to the seller. And if they tell us any information that's personal, confidential, motivations, needs, wants, and desires, we should keep that confidential too. Can we pause right there? Can we pause right there? Because we have a right to collect then, when they've hired the firm, personal and confidential information, motivation, needs, wants, and desires, right? Because we said we're going to keep it personal and confidential because that's one of our fiduciary duties between client and firm, right? Is to keep confidentiality for the term of the relationship. Now what?
Well, I know
Jeremy.
for sure, you have to disclose that you're gonna be, a dual agent for the seller and the buyer.
Jeremy.
Because if they don't like that, I guess they.
Thank you, Jeremy. Jeremy says, hey, now I'm sitting here thinking about it, but don't we have to disclose both to the seller and the buyer that we're representing both parties in a transaction? Does that make sense? Yes, because whether we have our buyer's hat on or seller's hat on, right? If we're going, if we're always going to remember that meeting at the settlement table, right? When you walk in, what are the million things that could happen? Oh, hey, who was our agent before? Alexandra? Alexandra was our agent, our listing agent before. John was our volunteer seller. Ryan was our volunteer buyer. And I got to be the buyer agent. So in this scenario, do we want to walk into settlement and closing and we go, oh, hey, Alexandra, awesome. It's so great to see you at the office meeting this morning. Don't we have the greatest Vic on earth?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yes, Alexandra says, yeah, absolutely, awesome Vic. What are those two things? Put the brakes on, but we're already at settlement, right? John's like, I didn't know they worked for the same firm. Ryan's saying, I didn't know they worked for the same firm. So what Jeremy commented about a few minutes ago is, don't we need to disclose that? And the answer is over-sounding yes, right?
It's almost like two girls dating the same guy and then they find out later.
Jeremy said it, I did it. Jeremy said, he said it's just like a guy dating two different girls and the two different girls don't know one about the other.
Now, there's a joke about closing the deal somewhere there, but I don't know.
John, I hear you. We'll just leave that to Jeremy. It sounds like a big problem for you.
Carrie Underwood
Well,
wrote a
thank you,
song
John.
about it.
Bruce, what did you say?
I said Carrie Underwood wrote a song about it.
And Carrie Underwood wrote a song about it.
Blown
Thank
away.
you, Bruce. Thank you, Bruce. So, Jeremy says, we should disclose it. Ryan should know that he's hired the same firm that the seller had. And we're gonna disclose that. I like that. And we're gonna disclose it before we do what? Show the property. And we're gonna get permission ahead of time. In what? Writing. We said earlier, we can have a verbal buyer agency agreement for a period of time here in North Carolina. Can we say that if I have a verbal buyer agency agreement with Ryan, that we can agree to dual agency verbally? Can we do that? Yeah. And if Alexandra has a written exclusive right to sell listing agreement with John, she's gonna have to get her permission for dual agency in writing. And then when he and I go sign our agency agreement and put it in writing prior to presenting the offer over here, then he's gonna put that agreement in writing for dual agency. Are we good so far? So we're gonna disclose it. If we find out, Dahlia says, you go and you find out, do that conversation separately, this one, don't share any personal and confidential information that the seller has shared with the buyer, and don't share any personal and confidential information that the buyer has shared with the seller. Does that sound good so far? Wonderful. What else?
Let's say you forget that thing, like you don't have it with you, but you go through it, because you memorized it, you've been doing this for years.
Oh,
And you're like,
good.
I need a piece of paper, so you get it out, and then you get them to write down, I, Jeremy, certified that you can be my dual agency, or dual agent. Can you do that? And then document it?
Jeremy, that is a good follow-up question. And here's what I think I heard you say. If for some reason we do not have this paper copy and we are talking to a buyer, can we go over this verbally and then agree in detail verbally, and then get an agreement verbally that he is agreed to hire my firm and he is agreed to dual agency? We can do that.
So
Yes.
you want to verbally do it, and then before the offer, grab one of those,
Yeah.
and then
Yes.
do it, instead of writing on paper. Okay.
Good question. Thank you for your
Or email
question.
it.
Yes. Are we good? What else do we want to know? What else do we want to know? We know we're going to get disclosure, we're going to get consent, we're going to keep personal and confidential information personal and confidential. What else sounds fair?
John just said email it.
Email it. Thank you, Bruce, for
Yeah.
follow-up. Remember, if we are not face-to-face, we are doing what? If we're not face-to-face, the Real Estate Commission rule says, we go over this verbally, go over the entire brochure verbally, then we're gonna need to follow it up what? We could follow it up via email, via mail. They need a hard copy within how many days?
3 days.
3 days. And then we're still gonna go over it with them again, now that they have the paper copy in front of them. Thank you, Bruce, for the follow-up. John? Wonderful. Thank you both for that. John and Bruce. So we've got this. So we said disclosure and consent. We said keep your personal and confidential information personal and confidential. Are y'all good for now?
Mhm.
And then let's build on that, right? Because we know Real Estate Commission Rule 0104, I and J says, of course, again, if we have a written employment agreement, it makes sense to get consent and disclosure in writing at the formation of the relationship. Because if we have a written agreement, we need to get anything else in writing. If we have a verbal agreement like we can do with a buyer, then we can get oral consent, and as soon as we reduce that to writing, then we're going to get written permission. So we agreed, keep personal and confidential information personal and confidential. I got all that. Ryan says, awesome. I've given you my consent. John says, hey, Orange Firm, I've given you my consent. They both hired Orange Firm. Now we go look at houses. And we drive up to, Ryan and I drive up to John's house. We get out, we go in. What does Ryan love? The house. And now he wants to make an offer. And now he wants to make an offer. What are we thinking now?
I was actually gonna ask that other question.
Wonderful,
Because that's what was
Dahlia.
sort of going through my head, so you've gotten the permission. You're reporting you've gotten the permission.
Gotten close,
I
gotten
was putting
permission.
my buyer's hat on, and I know that they're representing, the agency is representing the seller as well. How do I know? Like, would I feel like they would be really, looking for what I want versus the seller? I don't know that.
I guess that's where like trust comes in, right?
Right, and what Dahlia and Jeremy are kind of saying now, maybe some of you are thinking it, is great. I know client firm relationship. I know that you owe me fiduciary duties. Buyer and seller, the firm owes me fiduciary duties. You're gonna advocate for me. But if your firm is representing both the buyer and the seller in the same transaction, how can you advocate for both? How can you advocate for both? You all ask really good questions. I like the way you think. Because do conflicts exist? Sure. How are we going to deal with that? What sounds fair? We said, I know all Ryan's personal and confidential motivation, needs, wants, and desires because you shared all that with me because we have fiduciary relationship. I owe him duties. At the same time, John shared all of his personal confidential motivation, needs, wants, and desires with Alexandra. We both work for Owned Realty. They hired the firm, not us, the licensee. When it comes time to Ryan making an offer, and I said that I was going to advocate for him and help him get the best price and terms for him, how can I do that? Because then I'm violating the fiduciary duties my firm owes to John. So does it make sense that I have some limitations to Ryan when it comes to negotiating the offer, as does there some limitations to Alexandra when she gets the offer from Ryan when she's going to help John, the seller? So if we think about it, what's fair?
Would you
Jeremy?
treat it like a single agency, like you go and get the price for what they want it for, and then you take it to the seller, and then the seller either counter offers, and then you go back to John and say, no, like you're not telling them what to do, you're just getting the information from them.
Jeremy. Here's what I heard Jeremy say. Here's what I heard Jeremy say. Could we just, Ryan says, I want to buy that house. I go, awesome. And then Ryan says, what should I offer? Can I give you the scale? This is Ryan. This is John. I am the what? Firm. When Ryan says, Melea, what should I offer? If I tell him the market is saying John's type of home looks like it is, based on the data that I just handed you, looks like it's what? Overpriced. What did I just do? The firm just tipped the scales in whose direction? Ryan's.
Ryan's.
Does that seem fair?
No?
Let's keep it even. So when Ryan says, what should I offer, what could I say to keep the scales even?
What do you think you should offer?
The asking price, or good Alexandra, right? Asking price, or what would you like to offer? Ryan says, I don't know, full price? That would be great. Not great, I make no comment. I write what in the pre-printed form? Full price, whatever, $200,000. When he says, how much earnest money should I put down? What kind of earnest money? How much would you like to put down? I don't know.
Would that be frustrating?
Jeremy says, as we're going, Jeremy
That would
says,
frustrate me, you just tell me what I want, it's like, oh.
good point, Jeremy. As I'm answering Jeremy's question in a very long form, right? He says, how do you do that? How do you keep the scales even? Is that going to be frustrating? Wonderful. When you have a conversation and you're getting permission And consent, you're disclosing and getting consent from consumers to work as a dual agent. Are you setting the expectations and explaining it completely before you get to the writing the offer stage? So good point, Jeremy, right? Because I've already had the conversation with him way before we got to the offering stage, right? He already knows it's coming, because I've already explained it to him, because I had to by law. So he already knows what's coming. If he wants to write an offer on a property that my firm is representing, he already knows. I can't help him negotiate. Because as soon as I do, we're tipping the scale in his favor. And here's what I say. Ryan, great. Thank you for giving me all the information that you would like in order to fill in the pre-printed form, the blanks on the pre-printed form, the offer to purchase a contract form 2T, residential real estate sales here in North Carolina. I'm gonna go take your offer over to Alexandra. Alexandra, here's the offer. And here's what's gonna happen, Ryan. Alexandra's gonna have the same conversation with John that you and I have just had here. When Alexandra gets the offer and she takes it over to John, John's gonna go, oh my goodness gracious. Alexandra, what a great offer. What should I do? If she says, right, Dahlia says, let's keep it like this. Thank you, Dahlia. What would you like to do? Then we're staying steady. And then John goes, I don't know, tell me something personal and confidential about them. Alexandra says what? I have to keep personal and confidential information personal and confidential. If I don't, it does what? Tips the scale. So has she already prepared John for dual agency? It's not, sure, it's not a surprise. So valid point, Jeremy, right? Jeremy said, yes, that's it, irritating. I don't know, Ryan, what would you like to put in the body? Right? Of course it's irritating, yes, right? You're gonna have that conversation, explain in detail to the client what dual agency is, get consent, and then you've already set the expectation. By law, you set the expectation. So John goes, great, I know that your firm brought the buyer too. I got it, you can't help me negotiating, you cannot help me by giving me any personal, confidential motivation, needs, wants, and desires of the buyer. I got it, right? They already know. Guess what? What's Ryan gonna do? What's Ryan wanna do? Jeremy says, buy the house. Dahlia says, buy the house, thank you. What does John wanna do? Sell the house. What's important as a consumer for you to know? If you're buying a house that is listed by the same firm that represents you, the buyer, are the licensees limited to what types of services they offer the consumer in that case? Are we good?
Also, another thing, how are commission splits?
So Jeremy wants to, good question, Jeremy. Thank you for asking it. If we have, and let me make sure I have it right, if the buyer has hired the same firm that the seller has hired, how does the commission split work between whom? Because we know the listing agreement is between the seller and the firm, the seller's agreeing to pay the firm.
What about
Whatever, commissions are negotiable. And then between myself and Alexandra, how is that? The firm's commission split between the two licensees? Good question. Is that your question?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Jeremy,
do
good
they split
question.
in half? Do they give them separate? Like, he promised to do this, he promised to do that, and vice versa?
And good question, Jeremy. Valid point, right? Because why are we here getting our license? Money in our pocket. Could we volunteer our services? Sure. But most people come here because they want to get paid for the job that we do, right? And so, good question, Jeremy. Good question. How will the firm split the commission that comes into the firm? Whatever the firm's policy is regarding splitting commission that comes into the firm. So, good question, Jeremy. Does that answer it?
I mean, I guess that's another interview question.
Wonderful, Jeremy, good point. Are we gonna put that, Jeremy says that's another good interview question. So we